They abandoned her when she needed them most. 15 years later, when the doctor revealed the truth, her parents were left in complete shock. The rain poured down heavily as Emily Carter, just 14 years old, stood outside her family's house with nothing but a small bag and a heart full of pain. Her mother, Margaret, stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression cold and unmoving. "We did everything for you." Margaret's voice was sharp, cutting through the night. "And this is how you repay us? By throwing your life away?" Emily's father, Thomas, shook his head. "You've made your choices, Emily. Now you need to live with them." Her hands trembled as she clutched the straps of her bag. "But where will I go? I don't have anyone." Margaret's expression remained unforgiving. "That's not our concern anymore," and with that they shut the door, leaving her alone in the storm. Emily stood frozen, her breath shaky, the harsh reality settling in. She had no home, no money, and no one to turn to. With nowhere else to go, she began walking, her feet splashing against the wet pavement. But even as fear crept in, something inside her refused to break. She didn't know where life would take her. She didn't know that 15 years later, she would walk into a doctor's office and hear something that would leave her parents in absolute disbelief. What she would soon discover would change everything. The night Emily left home, she felt like the world had abandoned her. The streets were cold, unfamiliar, and terrifying. But she refused to let despair consume her. For weeks, she moved from one shelter to another, sometimes sleeping in train stations, sometimes relying on strangers' kindness. The days were long, the nights even longer. Loneliness became her constant companion. But then, something unexpected happened. An elderly woman named Helen, who worked at a small bakery, noticed Emily sitting outside in the rain one evening. She approached her with a warm smile and a fresh loaf of bread. "You look like you could use a little help," Helen said gently. Emily hesitated but nodded. Helen didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations. She simply offered her kindness. And for the first time since she had been abandoned, Emily felt safe. Helen took Emily under her wing, giving her a place to stay in her tiny apartment above the bakery. She taught her how to bake, how to manage a small business, and, most importantly, how to believe in herself again. Over the next 15 years, Emily worked tirelessly. She finished school, went to college, and eventually pursued a career in medicine, a field she had always dreamed of but never believed she could reach. She had no contact with her parents. They had made it clear they didn't want her in their lives. But fate had other plans. One afternoon, as Emily, now Dr. Emily Carter, walked into the hospital for her shift, she was called into an emergency case. A couple had been admitted with a serious health condition, and they needed a specialist's help. As she entered the room, her heart nearly stopped. Lying in the hospital beds were Margaret and Thomas, her parents. They looked frail and vulnerable, nothing like the strong, strict figures she remembered. They had no idea their attending doctor was the daughter they had abandoned 15 years ago. And when the truth was finally revealed, their reaction would shock everyone. Margaret and Thomas looked up as Dr. Emily Carter stepped into the room, clipboard in hand, her expression calm and professional. They didn't recognize her at first. How could they? The frightened, heartbroken girl they had abandoned 15 years ago had transformed into a strong, confident woman, a respected doctor. Emily, however, recognized them immediately. For a brief moment, memories of that stormy night came rushing back. The harsh words, the door slamming in her face, the feeling of being unwanted, but she didn't let those emotions control her. "Good afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. Carter," she said, her voice steady. "I'll be your attending physician today." Margaret squinted, her face tired and pale. "Dr. Carter?" she repeated, confusion flickering in her eyes. Then, as she looked closer, she froze. Her eyes widened, her breathing hitched. "No, it can't be," she whispered. Thomas sat up, his hands trembling. "Emily?" The room fell silent as the weight of the moment settled in. Emily met their stunned gazes, but there was no anger in her expression, no resentment, just a quiet, unshakable strength. "Yes," she confirmed. "It's me." Margaret covered her mouth, her eyes brimming with guilt and disbelief. Thomas simply stared, as if struggling to process the reality before him. "You're a doctor," he finally managed to say. Emily nodded. "I am." Margaret shook her head, tears spilling down her face. "But how? After you?" She couldn't even finish the sentence. Emily set down her clipboard and took a deep breath. "After you abandoned me?" she finished for her. Margaret flinched, as if the word had physically struck her. Thomas swallowed hard. "Emily, he hesitated. "We thought you would ruin your future. But look at you now. We were so wrong." Emily didn't speak for a moment. She just studied them, seeing them not as the figures of her painful past, but as two people who had made a terrible mistake and were finally facing the consequences. "You didn't just doubt me," she said softly. "You gave up on me." Tears streamed down Margaret's face. "We regret it every single day, Emily. Every day." Thomas, usually a man of pride and authority, looked defeated. "Can you ever forgive us?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily looked at them. The parents who had thrown her away, now sitting before her, broken and remorseful. And in that moment, she had a choice. What she said next would change everything. The room was heavy with silence, the air thick with unspoken pain. Emily looked at her parents, two people who had once been her entire world, but had also caused her deepest wound. They had thrown her out, abandoned her when she was just a child, left her to survive on her own. And now, 15 years later, they were sitting in front of her, asking for forgiveness. Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for Emily's wrist, her voice breaking. "We were wrong, Emily. We see that now. We don't deserve your kindness, but, please, if there's any part of you that can still see us as your parents, She choked on her words. Thomas, the once proud man who had turned his back on her, looked smaller, weaker. His eyes, ones that had been filled with judgment the last time she saw him, were now brimming with regret. "We lost you once," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We can't lose you again." Emily took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had spent years dreaming of this moment, of what she would say if she ever saw them again, of the anger, the pain, the questions she had carried for so long. But as she looked at them now, old, frail, broken by regret, she realized something. She had already won. She had survived. She had built a life for herself, had found love, success, and happiness despite their rejection. She was no longer that helpless 14-year-old girl begging to be loved. She was Dr. Emily Carter, strong, independent, and whole, and that was enough. She exhaled, then looked them in the eyes. "I forgave you a long time ago," she said softly. Margaret let out a quiet sob. Thomas closed his eyes, as if the weight of her words broke something inside him. "But," Emily continued, her voice steady, "forgiveness doesn't mean things can go back to how they were." Her mother nodded through her tears. "We understand." Emily hesitated, then reached into her coat pocket. She pulled out a small envelope and placed it on the bedside table. "This is the address of the woman who took me in when you didn't," she said. "Her name is Helen. If you ever want to understand what kind of love I deserved, go meet her." Margaret and Thomas exchanged a look, one filled with shame and gratitude. Emily turned toward the door, but before she left, she paused. "Take care of yourselves," she said. And then, with a quiet but powerful grace, she walked away, not as their abandoned daughter, but as the woman they never believed she could become. As the door clicked shut, Margaret clutched the envelope to her chest, tears still falling. And Thomas, staring at the space where his daughter had just stood, whispered the words he wished he had said 15 years ago. "We're so sorry, Emily. Have you ever faced betrayal from someone you loved? What did you do? Share your story in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. for more powerful stories like this.